actually real. They aren't an expert gunfighter, but we want them to feel like they are. So we have helper systems in place to support that ethos, to make reloading both realistic and easy to use under pressure. So as I mentioned, both hands are used to reload the pistol. One hand holds the pistol itself, the other one brings a fresh magazine up to the pistol. And when the player brings the magazine up to the pistol, we perform a number of checks to see if and how reloading is going to take place. So the first is obvious. We check to see if the gun is empty. Spent magazines are ejected automatically, although the player can manually eject a partially used magazine early if they want, with a button press. So we wanted to keep the reload system quick and action focused, strongly interactive, but we didn't want the player to get held up when ejecting a spent magazine. And also pressing a button to eject a magazine is not high value gameplay, so we just automated that stage. And equally, closing the chamber, the slide on the top of the gun, although maybe depending on the type of title it might be appropriate. For our demos, it wasn't something that a lot of players were going to be familiar with, and we didn't want them to get blocked on that too, so we automated that step as well. So as soon as a new magazine is inserted, the player can get straight back to lining up the next shot. So assuming the pistol doesn't contain a magazine, we move to the next check. And that is to measure the proximity of a new magazine to the pistol. So we do this by casting a cone from the butt of the pistol, and we check to see whether the contact point of the magazine falls within that range. We tune the size and the shape of this cone to strike a balance between ease of use, because we don't want the proximity requirements to be too demanding, but also realism, because we don't want reloading to commence when the magazine is unrealistically far from the pistol. This diagram exaggerates that distance quite a lot. It's considerably smaller than that in the actual title. So all being well, we move on to the next step, which is to look at the orientation of the magazine to the pistol. We compare the dot product of the two in 3 dimensions and see if it's within the limits that we set. Again, the actual limit is more generous than this diagram suggests, about 60 degrees. And this check is there to make sure that the player doesn't put the magazine in backwards or sideways, and if we didn't have that check in place, the interpolation that will follow would look particularly messy in some situations. And then the last thing we do is we compare the relative velocity of the magazine to the pistol. We've got no real threshold here, we just want to make sure that the magazine is moving towards the pistol rather than away from it, so that the player can't reload by passing the magazine through the pistol from the other side. Now this might seem like a lot of steps, and reloading hasn't begun yet. This all takes place in less than a millisecond, and if we get to the end of all those checks and everything's okay, then reloading is actually allowed to take place. So for the diagrams that follow, the pistol can be held in either hand, and in the images here, the suggestion is that the player is holding the pistol in their left hand, but that won't be shown. The hand in the diagram is representing the in-game representation, the leather glove, and the blue line is representing the move controller in real-world position. Glove and move controller are mapped one-to-one throughout almost all of the experience. So at the start of the process, the move controller and the glove occupy the same position. We've gone through all the previous checks. We say reloading is now allowed to take place. When reloading begins, the first thing we do is detach the glove and the magazine from the move controller, and we interpolate them into the correct position beneath the pistol. The proximity and orientation checks that preceded this ensure that this amount of movement is very small. And we tuned the duration of this interpolation, and we found that a good balance between responsiveness and visual tidiness was a little under half a second. So in this brief moment, the glove is no longer mapped one-to-one to the move controller. This is not generally desirable with move tracking. I've marked the significance of this by changing the blue line to red. But it was done in this particular instance to smooth very quick movements over very small distances, and it helped maintain the illusion of a solid connection between the glove and the magazine that it was holding. So as soon as the glove and the magazine have moved into position, the gloved hand opens and the magazine begins to move quickly into the pistol, reloading it. And immediately after that has occurred, the glove interpolates back to its correct position, mapped once again one-to-one with the move controller. So from the moment reloading actually commences to the moment the glove is returned to the exact position that it should be in is slightly under 1 second. All these checks and systems put together make the act of picking up a magazine, loading into the pistol, easy to perform, realistic feeling to the majority of players, So as much as possible, it looks believable and it feels believable, and most importantly, it fits the gameplay that surrounds it. So I'm going to wrap up this example with another short video. This shows the system in effect during a piece of gameplay lifted from the heist demo. It's worth trying to look for the moments that this is occurring. What you'll see is that it happens extremely quickly and that it's practically invisible. I do assure you it is in there, but it being invisible to the player was absolutely the intent of these systems. So let's take a look at that.
Got to get out of there before more arrive. Looks sharpish.
Not a very good shot.
Pull it down. Drop it now.
So that almost brings me to the end of what I have to discuss with you. I'd like to quickly summarise some of the ideas that I've covered here, and then we should have some time for questions at the end as well. So the first thing that I'm suggesting is that if players are fully immersed in a consistent world, they will follow the physical rules of that world for the best experience. Not only that, but they will increasingly act on instinct when interacting with that world, and that is something that we can use to our advantage if we're aware of it and we focus in on that. The second thing I'd like to suggest is that immersion comes from continuity, not from complexity. That even the simplest of experiences can be extremely believable so long as they behave consistently at all times. As mentioned, subconscious is expert at noticing when the rules are broken. It's very unforgiving. Now, because maintaining that continuity is so important, I recommend prioritising the most functional second-by-second mechanics, especially those related to player interaction with the experience, and be doubly cautious about adding any complexity to those interactions that is not absolutely necessary. The player's subconscious will accept all sorts of abstractions in the game world, such as the floating gloves, so long as they behave consistently at all times. And the last item refers back to the helper systems. Now, I just made the term up, helper systems. I made it up for this talk, in fact. The key item that I really want to focus in on there is the conflict between a fully immersed player acting under instinct and the relatively limited means they have for carrying out their intentions within the game's world. If we focus in on this so that the player is allowed to act under instinct, then I think that's very important. That's a very important focus to make, because if you get it right, the end result is extremely rewarding for the player. So I hope you found the talk interesting. I hope parts of it have been useful in your current work. Most of all, I hope it's opened some questions for you that you'd be interested in answering through your own work. All that remains to say is thank you, and we'll go to questions. We've got time to chat with Mike. There's a guy, hands straight up there, thank you.
Thanks for that. That was one of the more informative talks I've had during the 3 days here, so it's kind of great to see that. The question is there any kind of, before you went into this, is there any kind of theories or kind of methodologies which you followed? Possibly, and I'm from academia, so that's kind of where my interest is. Was there any that you were following, or was it mainly kind of trial and error and being able to kind of go back on that?
I think that there's a certain amount of trial and error in discovering what works and what doesn't, because VR is very different. I would say that the approach to discovering what works and what doesn't, we would just have to be extra strict. I think with conventional gaming, there's a certain amount of kind of leaping ahead that we could all do because we've got a lot of experience in that area. And when we were looking into VR, myself, the teams that I work with, the teams that Sony have got around the UK, around the world, everybody looking into this, we all had to kind of be very methodical in the way that we explore. I mean, things like user testing, things like prototyping, this is all stuff that's standard kind of day to day. But kind of trying to understand what works and what doesn't in VR, it's a new area, so we had to be particularly strict. And increasingly understand like the first principles of why things work and why they don't. So rather than just saying, we tried a broom and a broom didn't work, and we tried a top hat and a top hat did work, trying to understand what it is about a broom that worked, what it is about a top hat that didn't, so that we can start to build an understanding of really the smallest parts that make up a VR experience. So being strict is probably the short version of that answer.
Just a quick one. With the reload, using the moves, so they would actually, I'm just wondering, do the players actually touch the move controls, like sort of?
It's not necessary, but they do come in close proximity. I mean, what we found is that because you've got two hands and your hands are mapped exactly, what's the word? Proprioception. I'm sure I'm screwing that up, but basically the brain is aware of where the limbs are. You know, if you reach out to pick something up, you tend to look at the object. You don't really look at the hand that's leading to it because you understand where your hand is. So the move controllers, they do touch in some cases, but they don't have to. What we found is that if someone picks up an object and another object and goes to bring the two together, the journey to get those two lined up, it's not like if they were controlling it with a joypad, they would have to kind of look at the two pieces of geometry and align them. So it's hard to say. Was that the background to the question about whether they need to touch or not? Or?
And I was just wondering, did the players actually do that, or did it because you had the helpers and it would just kind of, I'm guessing, halfway through you would reload, so they would just give up and carry on?
No, I see what you mean. No, they tend to. So the proximity checks and the alignment checks that we use there, they are really small distances. What we wanted to avoid was that you pick up two items, do this, and then things magically fly across. We wanted to avoid snapping. We also wanted to avoid the move controller and the glove becoming detached over large distances. But what we found is that we could make those proximity checks really, really small because people would naturally do what they thought to be the correct action. So how the magazine is lined up, how it's inserted into a pistol might be something that people aren't familiar with. But as far as knowing that this object needs to go next to that one, that's something that pretty much everyone you watch it once, you instinctually know what to do. And so, yeah, they were pretty much bringing the objects together. If the proximity checks had been smaller, it probably would have still worked in most cases because people acting naturally were being very precise, as you might expect.
Hi, yeah, unfortunately I haven't myself had a chance to play any of your demos, so I was wondering if either for this system or any other systems you've made, did you ever have to teach the player how to reload with a tutorial, a kind of traditional tutorial? You know, normally you press B to reload. Do you have any equivalent to that with this system?
For these demos, I think what we took to the shows was pretty much a card, and it had probably two images on it. One of the main things that we had to teach, the way that players pick up and interact with objects is you hold the trigger and you move the object around and you let go of the trigger and it drops again. Now that behaviour is slightly different with a pistol, because you want you to be able to pick up the pistol in an understandable way, but equally pressing your thumb to fire the gun doesn't feel very natural. So when you pick the pistol up, the trigger is then the thing that shoots it, and if you want to drop the pistol again, you have to press the thumb button. That was the only thing that we needed to teach people. And that was definitely, as I mentioned about people acting under instinct, if you come at it from the point of view of what will we have to teach the player, then you'll probably end up having to teach them quite a lot of things. If you user test something and people don't get it with no explanation, then we would often go back to the start and look again, because people just being able to act under instinct and get the positive result from the game was really the number one kind of objective with all of these. Even in the case of the picking up blocks, you don't need any explanation for that. People are very quick to say, my finger on the trigger, that's how I close the hand. Once that's in their minds, they're away. One from the front? I was going to say from Jed, I do know him, full disclosure.
Hi John.
Hello.
Great talk.
Thank you.
I'm very familiar with the demos, obviously I've played them an awful lot. And a lot of the very cool things about it are things that you don't necessarily notice on the first time through. And it's quite resilient to replayability, and there's a lot of cool stuff in there that you discover. What was your process for kind of exploring that? Was it a user testing and see what people did and put responses in for those sort of things? Or did you just kind of think around the problems yourself and say, somebody will probably try this, let's put something in there to accommodate that?
We kind of come at it from both ends, really. So you would start out with kind of too many things to do, I suppose. Kind of rapid prototyping, lots of objects. I mean, the original version of that desk had tons of stuff on it. Cupboards that were more involved to open, had pictures, you turn the picture around, there'd be like a little phone number tucked in the back, it didn't mean anything. And it was really starting off with so many interactions that we knew that we would run into difficulty or we might run into player confusion, but we'd see what people tried to do first, we'd see what they found most interesting, and then we draw it back so that the average playthrough will interact with all the key things and feel like there's always something new to explore. So it was really striking that balance, but I would say that's probably the way that we approached it, is start off with too much but then be really strict, as I mentioned at the start, about recognising what was and wasn't working, and bring that back to a more comprehensive set of things to do. Cool. Thank you. It's just behind you.
Thank you. I'm also an academic, and I wanted to say that it is a pleasure to listen to something so rigorous.
Thank you so much.
And engaged, and actually about design. So I'm going back to the methodology question, because you're saying about being strict, and it's almost asking the same thing again. Were you using any pre-existing models in order to be strict, or is it completely heuristic about the top hat or the broom?
It's a good question. Whenever someone says it's a good question, half the time they mean it's a difficult question.
Well, it is, and it's not a
about it.
question in a vacuum, but I'm a semiotician, and for me, the hands are the lower, almost like the simplest level of a perceptual cue. They're an indexical sign. So it seems that you can use the simplest level of perceptual cues to trigger immersion.
Yes.
So I can make sense of it in my own rhetorical context.
I'm going to keep some of those words
Yes,
to further explain how gloves really work, but elbows don't. I would say that part of it is just the methodology that we use generally, that everybody in this room will use at some point, which is prototyping, kind of forming an idea and then going as broad as we can, very quickly going wide and getting a bunch of different options out of that idea and then coming in. I should say that when I say strict, I don't mean conservative. I think reinventing the wheel, the idea of reinventing the wheel is that it's a folly. I think setting out to see whether the wheel can be reinvented, so long as you can quickly discover whether or not that is going to be productive or not, is definitely a good thing to do. We started off reading a lot of, obviously VR is kind of older than this generation, and it really wasn't very successful until this point now, where it's really kind of coming together. So there was a lot of data out there about VR, and we definitely read an awful lot of that stuff. There's also simulation generally is used. Well, games are simulation of a sort, and military does a lot of work in using simulation for training, so there was a big wealth of papers dating back like 20 years that we could dig into and start to explore. But that was really just us trying to get a head around what the possible problems might be that we would encounter. What that doesn't do for us is what are we going to make, what questions are we going to answer. And that really is a balancing act between an ambition that we might have to create something. We've got an idea, this would be amazing. We don't know whether it would be amazing, but we think it would be. And then also, just like the simple prototypes, just starting to build up a library of things a player can do so that we can increasingly say, these things work consistently, and these things don't work so well. Or players find this really engaging, or if we set things up in a certain way, players will explore. And if we then build an environment in this way, they'll hit a wall with their exploration if we build it this way. So it's really, it all boils down to kind of the prototyping that we should all be doing generally, whatever kind of game.
So you're creating a methodology in practice?
Yeah, absolutely. It's about tracking results. One of the things that we definitely found to be an issue, I would say, very early on, is it's surprising how much you can very quickly get used to. Our aim is that when someone puts on a headset for the first time, and if one of our experiences is the first thing they've ever played, we want them to engage with that, we want them to be able to make progress, have a good time, understand what to do. And because we're wearing the headsets every single day, we really need to guard against us getting too used to them. This is probably, again, something that applies in games generally. You can start to work around issues without even realising you're doing it. And that's why not all of the studio works on VR, and that's really useful. Because we can go to a different floor, we can get a bunch of people who haven't put a headset on for months, or maybe even at all. That's changing increasingly, actually. Right at the start, it was really easy to find people in the building that have never done VR. Now, pretty much everyone has. So we'll be increasingly going externally. We use companies for wider usability testing to make sure that we get to see what it's like when someone isn't used to getting around the issues that we might have become familiar with.
Fascinating. Thank you.
Right behind you, 5 minutes. Dude's doing that 5 minutes. Oh, right, sorry.
Just wondering, did you do anything about any experiments with the user interfaces in VR?
Lots is the very short answer to that. As you can expect, so let me think about how to construct an answer to this. So everything in VR has depth to it, so that's one of the first issues. The biggest loss to game designers everywhere is we've got no edge of screen anymore. It's surprising how, even in talking about stuff, you talk about edge of screen, corner of screen, and of course that's gone. The edges of your peripheral view, that's a lower resolution because of the way the hardware works to give you the very best view where you're going to be looking most of the time. You can't push things very far to the side without losing some fidelity. Equally, you can't put them in the middle because that's where the experience is living, so that's the space you've got to keep clear for all the action that takes place. So we've got two types of situation. One is what kind of menus work well in VR. And we built a whole load of, in our studio and other parts of Sony around the UK as well, invested in looking at what kind of menus work in VR. But that's kind of the easier part to some degree, because when a menu is up, that's the thing you're going to look at and that's the thing you're going to interact with. Communicating other information to the player while they're in the game, that's the trickier part. You see in the heist demo, there's no information. We use a little bit of the screen jam, the kind of traditional sort of glowing the red into the edge of the screen when you get to, so I'm still saying it, the edge of the screen. From all around in your peripheral view, we glow the red in, and that's one of the tropes that we find actually still works very well in VR. Whereas a counter to tell you how many bullets you got left in the gun, well, we kind of think, you're not going to run out of magazines in this demo, and there's not a huge number of bullets in the gun, so we'll just let you run out. And then we know that we're going to build a reload system, or that's the intent, to build a reload system that means reloading is very quick. So in those particular demos, we've kind of avoided that problem. Further down the road, we won't be able to. Some of the things that we're looking at are some of the things the other studios are looking at. They need more information given to the player second by second, and they're having to confront that. One more here.
Got any experience with emotional connection between the representation of their own hand or body? Like if their leg becomes damaged, do they get a reaction?
Well, we've avoided. I don't have a sort of specific example like that. We don't have legs. Originally we did. It's one of the interesting things we saw in the very first versions of the avatar that we did. I mentioned that you could look down, you might see your knees, and if you crouched, then the knees would bend. And in that brief moment, extremely immersive. But then you sit down on a chair, you look down. I mean, some of these are problems that can be solved with more time. But you sit down on a chair, you look down, and if your thigh is slightly in a different place to where you would expect your thigh to be, because you're just aware of where your limbs are, then suddenly it's not your leg anymore. And that's a jarring moment. So I think there's kind of two ways to look at the question. The first one I can't answer because we don't have the parts, but I know that if you suggest to someone that this is you, and then something fractures that, that's an uncomfortable feeling. Not in a kind of, I feel unwell, but just
I think that's what I was kind of inferring, that it's an uncomfortable feeling, like you've got two hands. What if this guy looks like a torture scene? What if it gets removed and you see him physically remove that hand? That uncomfortableness is again.
I would expect that to be strong. There is data. There's some good experiments out there. I forget the particular name of it. It's like the rubber hand experiment.
Yeah.
You see the mirror. So there's a lot of data there, which we went through a lot of those papers. Certainly, if you can have a representation of the player in the world and they believe that it is them, like they do with the hands pretty consistently, then if you mistreat those hands, you will have an emotional response from the player. And the reason is because it's not the conscious mind feeling that, it's the subconscious that says, what's happening to my hand? So I think that's definitely something that I'm sure we will see experiences that focus in on that a lot more. My hand just hit.
Just wondering about the concept of movement within a world, because a lot of these demos are kind of static, and yes, so the focus is obviously on your hands. But I mean, I imagine a lot of genres in games want to have the ability to kind of go around the world. How would you deal with that in terms of immersion?
What I would say, so I suppose I've got some recommendations for how to approach that kind of thing. I don't think anyone has a solution yet, so I can't kind of say this is the way to do that. Really to highlight some of the problems. So one is what we describe as like if you're facing north and you want to turn around to face south, you don't want the player to be sitting facing backwards in their chair the whole time. So the big issue that we have there is the rotation of the head and the rotation of the body. Because in any traditional game, what you're essentially rotating in a first-person shooter is the body. And that's an area where finding ways to rotate the player's kind of center and not upset the fact that they're moving their head around, that's definitely one of the areas that is proving challenging. I would say as far as general movement off the spot, the main thing that people find uncomfortable and disorientating is acceleration. Because the thing that the body is used to feeling is acceleration. If you're moving at a constant velocity, you don't feel that without some external signal to tell you that that's taking place. What we found with some of our prototypes is we just remove acceleration completely. So if you were to start moving, we would snap you immediately to constant velocity. And once that seems strange, it doesn't feel uncomfortable. So we take the part that's the problem. The other way of approaching that is to make the acceleration very gentle, so that what the body would expect to feel would be a very low amount of force. But I think that's going to be an area that some people are going to fix it in a certain way for a certain experience. I don't think we're going to see a kind of 100%, this is how you do movement in VR. There's a fundamental rule there that we have to find ways. We have to be able to trick the subconscious yet again, really, to make it accept that it can't feel movement when movement's taking place. So we're out of time for questions. Thank you, there are lots of questions. I like the questions bit. Housekeeping slides, sorry. Please do get the app, please rate the talks, enjoy the rest of the conference. This kind of stuff helps the organisers make it better every year by keeping out the likes of you, so please do this. Thank you very much.